If you have two shoes, please sell one and buy a sword. If you have two trousers, please sell one and buy a sword. Because now it is time for revolution. And this revolution is no longer on the streets. This revolution is not about burning cars. It's not about angry faces. This revolution is in the mind. It is about building our own cars, selling them to make our own money. Because if we are not in charge of our thoughts, of our mind, then the one who controls our mind will make our bodies the tools of self-oppression. That is why Steve Biko said also that the most potent weapon in the hands of the oppressor, it is the mind of the oppressed. So your mind is very important. Your mind is absolutely everything about you. And if you can own your own mind, your own thoughts, and control them, then you own your life. You are in charge of your life. But if somebody else can control your mind, somebody else can dictate your thoughts, then that person is in charge of your life. You see, most thinkers, philosophers, when you read them, where they talk about Buddha, talk about Jesus, all of them, no matter how they differed, but they had one thing in common to say about a human being and his condition. And what they said was, as a man thinketh, so is he. You see, as you think, so is your reality. In other words, our reality, our overall reality, is actually the reflection of the thought patterns that are going on in our mind. And if you want to change the condition of a person, you're going to have to change how they think. If you want to change the situation of somebody, you're going to just have to change how they think. And because a person is a member of society, then you want to change the society, you then have to change how people think in that particular society, because as people think, then is their society. You know, the same way is the same way is the case for an individual, is also the same way. It is also the same for the society. As people think, so is their society. And if we are willing to change the society, what we need to do is to change the mindset of the people. What we see in our community, whether it's good or bad, the crimes, the beautiful things, all that we observe in the society, you know what it is the products of the people's minds, is the reflection of what is going on in the people's mind. And the way we want to change the society, if we want to get an effective change, a sustainable change of the society, we don't have to invest a lot of money in building jails. We don't have to build prisons. We need to build schools. We need to build schools. We need to invest into the education of the people, because through education we'll be able to then change the mindset of the people. And when we change the mindset of the people, we will be changing the actions of the people. You know, and once we change the actions of the people, we'll be able to get a different society from what we have and what we don't like, of course. So, in a nutshell, jails, prisons, any means of coercion is not the right way to change the society. Even though we are investing heavily in those things, it's not a sustainable way to change the society. The best way to change the society is to change the people's minds by education. Now, talking about education, as we are dealing with the tools of African liberation, one thing that Frederick Douglass said is that it is easy to raise strong children than to change a broken man. So that is to say that if we then want to invest in the education, we then need to invest in the education of the young people, of the children, right? Because education is the preparation of the future generation. And who is the future if it's not the young people, right? What is the future if it's not really the young people that we have today? And that is where we need to focus our attention and our investment in terms of education, because by educating them, we are then preparing the future of Africa to be the future that we want, because through that education we'll be able to eventually predict what kind of actions we can expect in the future. Now, what is the content of the education that we want in Africa? Or actually, what is the structure? What is the structure of education in Africa is another important question. And it's an important question because for a long time we have been navigating with the educational system structured by colonial institutions and prepared only to make us as African people tools of the capitalist industry, as we have discussed this topic extensively in the previous topic related to the tools of African liberation, and we were talking particularly about the education as an important tool. And that is why we need to continue to elaborate more on the topic of education, because if we succeed with education in Africa, then it will take us only 20 years to get Africa a new Africa, to change Africa. You see, because it takes 20 years, one generation, 20 years to change things. We focus in one generation of kids and redesign the educational system and focus on that particular generation of the children. We'll be able to to redesign the blueprint for Africa and to recreate the Africa that we want. And it takes only 20 years. That's what it takes. So the most important question is of the content and of the structure of the education. It means, what is that educational system need to approach or need to tackle in terms of its content? Now, number one, education needs to teach people about themselves. Education needs to familiarize people with themselves. Now, when you look in Africa today, we have education that teaches about other people rather than about ourselves. Why don't we study Imhotep in our formal education? Is our ancestor, is a genius, African genius. Why don't we study Ptahhotep? Why don't we study Sheikh Anta Diop? Why don't we study Marcus Garvey? You see, so we have education that is not teaching us about ourselves, because if it has to teach us about those people, then it teaches us about the struggle, to how to struggle, and it will have to make us to identify ourselves with those ancestors who struggle for African liberation and African emancipation. So you see, the realities today, if we want to know about Sheikh Anta Diop, Imhotep, all those great ancestors of Africa, we need to go on YouTube, we need to go on internet to Google them. But in formal education, I studied community development. I didn't come across any subjects that has to deal with my ancestors. So we have educational system structured to fit the needs of European children, but not the needs of African children. So education needs to be restructured in Africa to teach African people about themselves first of all. I think there's a book called Stolen Legacy by Joe J. James, if I'm not mistaken. He said in the book that the first lesson that we need to teach to humanity is about their own contribution. I mean, the first lesson that we need to teach to every people is about their own contribution to the humanity. And secondly, then we can teach them about other people. And this is reverse in Africa, because we are taught about other people and we have to make use of internet to learn about ourselves. And this is not the education that we need. Education that strips us with the knowledge of self and begin to feed us with the prides of other people is an education system that creates inferiority complex in African person, and is not an educational system that is fit to create Africa who is in charge of his reality and his life. Now, number two thing that education needs to teach people is to teach them about the environment. You see, everything that we do, everything that we want to do, or everything that we need as a tools or the economy need to be extracted from the environment in which we are living. So the knowledge of the environment is very important. So a proper education, after it has taught people about themselves, it has to introduce people to the environment. Education needs to teach you about the possibilities that are surrounding you in your community. It's not really frustrating when we see that we have Indians coming from India, or we have Chinese coming from China to Africa. Within a space of 1 or 2 months, they own shops, they own supermarkets in our own communities. How did they come to realize that there are opportunities of business in these communities while we were born in those communities, but we don't realize those things? Because simply we don't have a proper education that teaches us the possibilities around us, education that teaches us the opportunities in our environment. We rather have education that teaches us only, or that presents us the impossibilities of our environment, so that we have our focus somewhere else. That is why today in Africa, you ask most of young Africans who are into the churches, who are into schools, they will tell you that their dreams is located in Paris, in London, in England, and now sometimes in Dubai, because we have been taught much about that environment through television, through mass media, through internet. We have been introduced more into that environment, so that we have loved that environment and we don't care about Africa, because we don't know much about Africa, right? That's why you go into the African communities today. In most communities, you see that people who own supermarkets, the people who own shops, the people who sell even bread, even sugar to our people in those communities are Chinese, Bangladeshis, Indians, Pakistanis, and stuff like that. Simply because we don't have a proper education that is supposed to introduce us to the possibilities and opportunities of our own environments. Now, number three thing that education needs to provide to the people is then the means to affect the environment. You see, knowing the environment is one thing, but being able now to affect that environment, to manipulate the environment in order to produce out of it what you need, the products or the service or anything that you need to meet your needs, and also to supply to other people's needs, and therefore create business, create exchanges, and create markets. That is one thing that education needs to provide us, the knowledge on how to use the environment, to use the resources in our environments, to then use those resources in order to create the markets, to create the business, to trades with other people. That is the knowledge. That's number three thing that education or any proper educational system needs to provide to the African people. You see, we need to know the markets, and we need to know how to use that market. We need to know the opportunities. We need to know there are diamonds, there are goals, there are stuff in our environments, but we also need the knowledge of what to do with those resources, in order to transform them into the products or services that can then be traded with other people in order to create our economy, to improve our currency, and to make our own money. That's very important. And mostly today, the economy of today is not solely based on natural resources. It's based on the knowledge, right? Whoever who is able to use knowledge and create service or create something that is useful to others is able to create money. Amazon didn't need natural resources. It needed knowledge, right? Uber didn't need natural resources. It needed knowledge. So we need that kind of ability to transform the challenges that we have in our communities into opportunities to make money, right? So that's what education needs to provide in the third level. And the fourth thing that education needs to provide to us as African people is the ability to socialize with one another as African people. Education needs to be the interface that brings people together to socialize so that we can then nurture our society and even improve our society. Education needs to be a place where people come together and to learn how to live together as a citizen of Africa. Education shouldn't be a place where tribalism is created, where ethnicism is created, where xenophobia is created. Rather, education needs to be a platform that really further Pan-Africanism, a place where we come together and we learn how to collaborate, how to work together as a member or as members of the society in order to achieve collective goals that we have for our society. This is very important. So when you check, when you scan, when you monitor what is happening currently in Africa, you see that we are running short of these important inputs or this important structure of education in our educational system. We don't have education that teaches us about us. We don't have education that teaches us about environment in which we are. We don't have an education that teaches us about how to use the resources of our environment, and we don't have the education that socializes as African people. And we need to create that, and that's how we need to use the educational system as the tool for African liberation and African emancipation. It's very important, and that's the only way we can guarantee that within 20 years we have then recreated a new Africa through a new generation educated in an Afrocentric perspective in order to take charge of Africa moving forward. And that's how we have a chance to recreate Africa as a global power base. Now, before I finish, based on the fact that education needs to teach you about your environment, what do you expect from the African intellectual who is educated in University of Paris, who is educated in a university in London? Because that university is supposed to be teaching that particular person about the London environment. And this is the problem whereby we, especially the African intellectuals, the politicians, the people who have money in Africa, they don't want to fund education or create a proper education in Africa because they rely on the University of Boston, London to send their children there to be educated there in a different environment and to learn about different environment, and expect those children to come back to Africa and lead Africa in a proper manner and succeed. It is impossible because those people have been groomed in a different environment with the knowledge of different environments, and when you bring them in Africa, Africa is totally a strange environment for them, and they cannot realize, even discover the opportunities that are in Africa. That is why most of these leaders educated in the Western system, they tend to behave themselves as a little British, as little Portuguese, as a little French, according to where they have been groomed. And they try to drag the masses of African people in that same way of deprivation of knowledge of self, the same way of destruction of African culture and African value systems, right? They've always behaved arrogantly towards the African traditional chiefs, who are actually the custodians of African culture, African value systems, and African ways of life. And this is something that cannot contribute to the agenda of reconstructing Africa as a global power base. So we need to restructure the education, and those who are in charge of Africa today need to find the necessity of funding proper education in Africa so that we don't have to send our future leaders outside of Africa to be groomed in France, in Paris, in London, because they become strangers to themselves. In other words, they alienate themselves so that they become irrelevant to Africa. So we need to be educated right here in the African environment. So whatever knowledge that we need to bring it right here to Africa and structured in the Afrocentric perspective, so that we can have out of that educational system truly Africans who are able to take charge of African affairs. I hope this discussion has been useful to us, and if it is, please subscribe, like, and share the video. It will help us a lot, help us to reach as many people as we can, because this agenda is really for African people. It's really for African liberation and African emancipation. So if you have two shoes, please sell one and buy a sword. If you have two trousers, please sell one and buy a sword, because now it is time for revolution. And this revolution is no longer on the streets. This revolution is in the mind. If we are in charge of our mind, we are definitely in charge of our lives and in the driving seat of our destiny. Peace and love, freedom and decolonization to all African people from wherever you are. See you next time. Bye-bye.